My name is Dennis Sungmin Kim. I'm an animator, filmmaker. Primarily make animated films in a 2D hand-drawn format. I guess what we're going to be talking about is the film called EI Emotional Intelligence, which was a film that I had back in 2017.
My name is Noah Wagner. I'm a director as well as a producer, writer, and editor, but primarily directing. I was in NFFTY 2014 with a different film from the one we'll be talking about today, which is called Watch Room, a fellow sci-fi project. I work in primarily live action. I kind of describe it as grounded genre. So I'm especially excited to chat with you, Dennis, about, you work in a different medium than me, but we share a lot of similar, I think, tastes and interests, especially regarding science fiction and regarding world building and kind of, using genre to express deep felt feelings and thoughts through metaphor and whatnot. So, but before we kind of dive into what makes us so similar, I'd be curious to hear how you started as a filmmaker. What was the first project that kind of helped you fall in love with filmmaking?
Yeah, so as a lot of, I think, NFFTY filmmakers can probably relate to, I've made short films throughout childhood, and that's kind of just been a thing. It's like a lot of it's like the Christopher Nolan way of saying, oh, I was just doing Simpsons, I was 4 years old, but it's, for a lot of NFFTY filmmakers, that's kind of true. But you could argue that it's is those kind of smallest things, and then I just kind of grew into it, and then I just didn't really stop. Or it's so there's a high school film festival back when I attended high school, and I made this very, very rough, small animated short film, and I was screened before a very, very large audience at the high school film festival, and that's kind of electrifying moment where I guess what Spielberg would say, bitten by the bug. And then so I started there, and then I was making a couple more short films throughout high school, and then I got this short film called Elliot into NFFTY, which I was very fortunate to have.
I love that movie, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I got, I had Elliot in, and then I participated in NFFTY, and I kind of had the motivation. I was telling everyone, I was oh, I have a new film that I'm working on, and that was EI at that time. And so I received the right amount of inspiration and motivation to kind of just push myself to really finish that film at that point. Same question for you as well, filmmaking for you, when did it all begin?
I'm not sure it even was so much a big audience. So I got my start, strangely enough, a lot of my neighbors were into skateboarding, and I can't skateboard for my life. So the way I kind of fit in with my friends was filming them skateboarding. And I just very naturally would use a skateboard as a dolly and just figuring out what are some cool shots I can grab of my friends who weren't good skateboarders, by the way. I just wanted to make them look cool, and they had little ramps and stuff. And so I had all this footage that I thought was really cool. And then I took this iMovie class at the time. That was the editing program, and kind of compiled it together. And there's just sort of a sensation of putting footage you had shot that seemed like just home videos to music and editing, and it just felt more like a real film. And just, I guess the bug for me was just playing it back for those friends in our living room, just dying laughing. And I think over time, obviously, things got a little bit more elaborate as I got older and started realizing, oh, this isn't just some hobby. This is a really cool way to tell stories and express ways I'm feeling, and I can write a script. It doesn't just have to be, just home videos. And so, I started making, films with story. And it was really actually not until I got into film school where I really started telling more stories with narrative. And there was one film called Plush Gun, a Puppet Noir, which is, we had to shoot films on 16 millimeter. It was in black and white. And we had to edit the films by hand, which was a really great lesson in being very deliberate when you edit, because every time you edit, you're literally slicing the film, and it's going to be not as good when you try to splice it back together. And it was just about puppets, Muppet type puppets, trying to solve a mystery, but it was kind of more rated R and had lots of puns. And that's kind of how I got my start falling in love. But I agree. I mean, I think you watch films and you're just amazed by what's possible, and it captures your imagination, and then you want to do it yourself. And it's just kind of a really interesting moment when that clicks. When you first started out, making your films, and even today, like, are there any sort of resources that you were using to aid the process, or anything in particular that helped you?
At that time, and place for me, like, I think one of the best resources that I had was specifically when I was making EI, I was like a freshman in college, and I guess it was the help that my college professor and like my animation professor offered, and some student feedback that I had during class. Wow, it's already been, for me, it's been like 5 years since I've made this film, and now I recently finished university, and it's easy to really find yourself, especially when you're doing an animation like all by yourself. It's like it's so easy to find yourself in a bubble where you don't really have, where you lose that. I mean, a lot of other people can find this, with like live action projects too, but like you definitely would appreciate like an outsider's perspective who could, like look at the story or the storyboards differently. And so there's that. And also I kind of just looked out to like Vimeo's staff picks, or like Short of the Week, which was like my personal online film festivals back then. It's like for inspiration, or like reference for like, oh, it's like what is considered to be like, I guess, like cutting edge, like that, I don't know, artistically, so.
I worked in the animation department. I wasn't an animator, but I was a TA in the animation department when I went to film school. And something I noticed was a lot of people did have to like kind of work in solitude. Like it was kind of a crew of one, or not that many people, but people would collaborate on different people's projects. So would you kind of find that similarly? Like you kind of were like, you had to do almost everything yourself, because it's different in live action. It's very difficult, unless you're doing maybe a documentary, to do everything yourself. And I was always amazed with what could be done with a team of one, even if you're like just getting started and you don't have those collaborators yet.
What I could say is that for live action, it's amazing what can be achieved with the crew in like in a short span of time. But I would have to think that it's like animation offers like a lot of control, but like it's all like all the responsibilities on you. Versus like live action is definitely more team oriented, and the responsibility is a little bit more diffused, I think. What are certain resources that you guys think?
Yeah, I was going to bring Watchroom up because it definitely was not my first film I ever made. It's definitely the most recent film that I've made, and definitely the one I'm the most proud of. Resources when I started out, I kind of had to break it up into two categories. When I started out, it was definitely more just watching other films, whether online or just at the time I was renting stuff, but collaborating with friends and not putting any pressure on what I'm making, and just tinkering and doing experiments and proofs of concept and whatnot. And then I get older, there's lots of tutorials online on YouTube especially, but at this point I'm pretty amazed. I'm teaching myself, virtual production now. I didn't have access to that in school. And it's just pretty amazing. If there's something you want to learn, chances are there's a tutorial for it somewhere online, whether for free, most likely for free, or maybe behind a paywall. But as far as Watchroom's concerned, that took a village. That was the biggest project by far I've worked on, the biggest budget, the biggest crew, the most resources. And even then, it's funny, it doesn't really matter how big a project is, or you still have to stretch a penny in order to actually reach like the vision you have for it. We did a Kickstarter to start things off, and I could do a whole TED talk on just Kickstarters and how much of a part-time job or full-time job that was before we even made the film. But I will say, and it's a little off topic, but I will say lookbooks, doing pitch videos, doing sizzles, doing all the things that as you get older, you have to make in order to prove to the powers that be, that can, AKA financiers and things, if you're trying to do something with a lot of money, that prove to them that you know what you're doing or what your vision is, kind of really serve as a way to clarify for yourself what it is you want to do and what your vision is. Like, I don't know about you, but when I start making a project, I have like in my mind's eye what the movie is. And then I sat down to write it. And of course it gets more clarified, and I realize, oh, I didn't think about this. I didn't think about that. And then when it comes to a sizzle or a lookbook or a tone reel or something, I once again am clarifying, like finding reference images, things that I can then share with my collaborators. And it really helps just kind of clarify and specify. So that's kind of like it's kind of like a tip that I would give, or at least perspective, because I remember thinking it was such a chore when I was first started out, and now I think I do that more than the finished pieces. It feels like sometimes. What's your experience with that?
That's the great benefit of animated short films, especially when you're like working by yourself. Like a live action film, if you want to have like a very particularly like, if you want to use like really expensive cameras or like have like name value actors and stuff, I would assume that you would want a budget. But I think like animated short films, like your budget is like the materials that you need, or sometimes like voice actors. That's yeah, it's mostly just like getting software and just kind of getting enough material, because I use a very analog approach. It's mostly like watercolor paper and like some paint and that, you know, it doesn't cost that much compared to like I would assume for like a live action short film. But so it's like that kind of process is very, I've been fortunate to have a lot of those kind of practical means of like gathering resources like omitted because I kind of just like, yeah, it's mostly like drawings. You start with drawings and then you kind of like end with drawings. Yeah, throughout the years, I've like, for like Elliot, I had my high school English teacher read, you know, the narration, and like I had a friend who's also nifty. He helped me record the sound, and I had a composer friend who was willing to work for free, and even for like EI, I had a narrator I met in my screenwriting class, and he was able to offer his talents. So yeah, the process is not as like, I mean, you can certainly, like I know a lot of people who have set up like Kickstarters or like crowdfunding campaigns in order to fund their animated short films as well. But for me, I have not had that experience yet.
Yeah, it's know what you're getting into, but I mean, it's interesting you were saying about, you know, your collaborators on both EI and Elliot, you know, being people who were classmates of yours or people who worked on your last film. I mean, I definitely found the same way for Watch Room. It was this confluence of like a friend I went to film school here, or I had gone to a bunch of artist dinner things with my writing partner, who became just like kind of my brother from another mother at this point. And my producer was from a different part of my life, and my other producer was from a completely non-film related part, and they all kind of came together under the cause of the film. And you just got to kind of be that rallying cry. But it's all people you know well, you feel comfortable with, and then their network of people too, and you kind of just build that family from that. But I will say, you know, Watch Room, you know, was, like I said, kind of a bigger project for me, but the Kickstarter video for that was maybe, you know, $100 or $200 to make, because I had seen a lot of Kickstarter videos, and this comes back to the proof of concept thing, that were just kind of people talking, which is fine. I think a lot of people do that, but I felt like if I'm going to trust anyone to donate money, especially people who don't know me well, because there's no way we were going to raise all the money from just people I knew, or at least knew like so well that I could count on them for like $10. So I wanted to make something that if anyone watched it objectively, they'd be like, oh, this person knows what they're doing. You know, if the proof of concept is solid, the movie's going to be great. I'll give them the money. I'm confident. And I was pretty amazed what could be done between just editing, found footage, us talking, and we just, you know, stole some drone photography that's pretty much where all the money went, was hiring a drone to photograph like a girl standing by a lighthouse, and in the end, there was no lighthouse in my film because last second, you know, the location bailed on us. And so it was supposed to be a lighthouse on a cliff. And as you'll see in the movie, it's just a cliff. And that's because last second, the Coast Guard was working on one of the Transformers movies in the area. And so he couldn't work on ours. So we had to like, you know, MacGyver the thing. But that's another valuable lesson, is just sort of leaning in. Like, you're always going to have curveballs thrown your way, and it's just, you know, up to you to decide whether to resist them or look at them as opportunities to improve your film.
I think you really kind of like nailed like what you mean by like grounded genre. Like with Watch Room, there's the, yeah, I want to ask you about like the set, the garage aesthetic. I was watching it on Dust, and I was going through the comments too, and then it's like some people were like talking about you know, how like the big tech, you know, origins come from like the garage, and that's like, was that a inspiration, or is like I think, yeah, just to kind of begin talking about Watch Room, I think I want to ask you about the set. Like, what was the inspiration, and what was it like shooting there, and you know, whatever, anything else that you want to talk about that.
And you've clued in on something that we put a lot of thought into, because you're right. You know, like, you know, the stories of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were like building Apple out of their garage, and lots of tech companies have that sort of like origin story. And we felt the same way, that we wanted to kind of have this like maverick spirit to a garage setting. And so that was an empty garage to begin with. It was my producer's parents' garage, and we had to art the whole thing from scratch. Our production designer did a really tremendous job on a budget. We wanted it to feel almost anachronistic between the technology that they were building versus the like kind of old analog stuff they had lying around. But that was a really, really important thing, was to sort of make it feel lived in, make it feel real, make it feel immediate. Whereas the technology, because the technology is, we did research on this, it's not as far off as it seems. And that's why we wanted to kind of ground it in the now. And it's also kind of a fun fact, the garage is in Connecticut, but the cliffs are in south of San Francisco, in like the San Jose area. So we wanted to, it didn't have to be that way, but once again, it was a matter of what resources did we have. Well, the garage location was free. The cliff location was actually close to free. And that was the result of the lighthouse falling out. The lighthouse would have been very expensive. I had the benefit of editing all of the garage scenes together and knowing kind of how they would fit and what material I needed at the cliffs in order to fit them in together.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how, you know, it wasn't like this dense, you know, and you had some breathing room between, and then you're kind of like editing between. That's actually, it's like not the traditional approach of like shooting and then like editing and like in live action, which, you know, it's like versus like animation where everything kind of could happen all together. For the people who've watched the film, you could like, I think what really stood out for me throughout the experience was like obviously the aspect ratios and like how it was used for like storytelling. I guess like we could talk about that, but also I want to ask you about like, are you interested in VR/AR storytelling too, going into the future after having like worked on this?
I think part of it was in trying out VR when we shot the film, which we shot the film in 2017. So I was playing with VR right around then, and at the time it was like the Samsung Gear and the Google Cardboard and the Vive, which was tethered to like a high-powered PC. Not even remotely like where we're at with the Oculus Quest 2, which is leaps and bounds, and that's in 5 years. Yeah, I would be very curious to do storytelling in VR. I think it would be a very different approach. I approach it more as like immersive theater than an actual film, because, you know, in a normal film you have this box right here, and in VR you can look everywhere. The whole world, 360 degrees, is your canvas, and you can't control. You can steer, but you can't control where audience members are going to be looking. But you mentioned Dust earlier, which is a sci-fi platform for short films. It's been a really good resource that both of our films on, and I was curious to hear more about EI, and like, is sci-fi something that you're interested, you want to like live in that space, or like where do your interests lie, and like tell me how you came to creating EI.
Oh man, yeah, science fiction. Like, so back in like when I was kind of like you know, the primordial inspirational soup for EI was like I had a bunch of tech friends who were really into like, this is back in like late 2015, like when like the discussion where like AI was really kind of taking off, and like that's when the discussion was kind of just being thrown around between me and my friends a lot. But to kind of answer your question, it kind of started with a lot of my like, even for like Elliot, like science fiction has been one of my favorite genres. And also like, if existentialism is a genre, I would dip my toes into. So it's like, and it's so right with science fiction when it comes to like artificial, like, you know, intelligence. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if I kind of steered into somewhere else. But I think what I appreciate about science fiction is how a lot of the elements of technology are literally capable of actually influence our human experience today. You know, I think even our lives were changed, like the jump between like not having a smartphone to having a smartphone, that was like radically, you know, and like, so I think everyone was kind of aware of the extent to which like technology, it's always like a bedrock for inspiration and stuff. So,
I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of topics, a wide range. What's the best piece of advice that you've received about filmmaking?
At this point, where I've been making short films for about like 6 years or longer, like, you know, like these animated short films, I would say that you got to really know why you really want to tell this short story. You really need to know why you need to tell the story in this particular medium. And it's for me, it's always asked during the writing process, but it's like as you continue to kind of work on bigger, more ambitious projects going into the future, you always need to have this sort of answer to keep yourself motivated. And yeah, it's a very, very emotional journey that like a lot of filmmakers are going to.
Yeah, those are both really good points. I think I have two. They'd probably be one, just don't wait for anyone to say, like, give you permission to make something. Just go ahead and make it. And that's very reductive in some ways, especially if you've got some ambitions. But like I said, the Kickstarter video for Watch Room, I couldn't have made Watch Room out of, just like that. But the Kickstarter video cost almost nothing. And then the other piece, I remember a professor I had said there's 4 words to live by. There's prepare, 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 improvise. And he was talking about directing and how, like, you're doing all this rehearsal, but once you're on set, you're improvising, and you got to keep your eyes peeled and be open to little accidents that happen that you're like, oh, this is more natural and better than anything I could have imagined in my brain. I think it's true for life too, but I think those are kind of the 2 pieces of advice that I would stick with.